Hey, AP scholars, as promised, we're going to be talking about inheritance and polymorphism in Java, which is the last part of the course, really, that you need to know. It's going to seem fairly complicated, and we're going to take our time to go over this, so get ready for a fairly long chat about these topics, and make sure you come to class with lots of questions. This PowerPointy thing, it's actually a PDF, is available on Teams, and so is these example classes that will frame our examples for understanding what's going on. So I highly recommend you take a look at these already. In class, I handed this out on a piece of paper, so if you have that, that's great. Otherwise, find it in Teams, and you can read it as you go. So we're going to take a look. Oops, let's see. Where'd that go? We're taking a look at these two topics. Inheritance is all about classes extending other classes. It's going to create this hierarchy of classes that we'll refer to as sort of subclasses and superclasses. So we're going to have to understand that. And then we're going to understand what happens when you extend a class. What does a subclass get from a superclass? And it's also going to open up some interesting problems that we'll have to solve, and that'll be kind of part of the trick questions and knowledge that you'll need to demonstrate on the AP exam. The second part here is called polymorphism, which is clearly a fancy word. This topic is all about what happens when a subclass and a superclass have a method that has the same name. So you might wonder why you might do that. Good question. We'll talk about that. And also, you might wonder, well, which method gets called if you call one of these methods. It's called overridden methods. And that mechanism by which Java chooses which method to call is called polymorphism, basically. And there's some very specific rules, but that can lead to some weird situations. So we're going to have to examine that and see what's going on there. Okay, so we'll start with inheritance. Inheritance will be the first thing we talk about. So if you look over those classes, we have class person, and it has a variety of things going on. It's got some instance variables, it's got a constructor, it's got some accessor methods, some mutator methods, lots of good stuff. The next class is called students, and it extends person. So that's the new thing. This is where the whole idea of subclasses and superclasses will come in. And notice that later on, we'll get a class called undergrad, which extends student. So we get another level of extending. So we are extending student, and student is extending person. And then, of course, we have grad student, which also extends student. So that's sort of the setup of what we're going on here. And I have a diagram that'll summarize what's happening here. The employee class we haven't seen yet. It's hypothetical. And we'll maybe get a chance to talk about it, or we might talk about it in class. So here's our person class. It's extended by student, and then student is extended by these two classes, grad and undergrad student. So that's sort of the setup of the structure, a visualization of the structure. So just to be clear about what the terminology here, a student here is a superclass for grad student and undergrad. And student is a subclass of person. Do you see how that works? Basically, if you extend a class, that class is your superclass. You are extending it. You're building on that foundation, so it's your superclass. You are a subclass of your superclass. So if you were extending something, then you've become a subclass because you're not all on your own. You are kind of dependent on this other class. So student is both a superclass and a subclass. Person is a superclass. Technically, we'll get later on into, there's a secret superclass to all classes that are, even if you don't extend something with that extends keyword, there's an object class, which we will talk about, and you'll wonder about this secret knowledge you've discovered. So it'll be exciting. So just to be clear about this diagram, hopefully that makes sense, but also to see in the code, to make sure this makes sense, we can see that public class person is not extending anything. Secretly it is extending the object class, but we'll get into that later. But check out student extends person. So we can see that student is a subclass of person, and person is student subclass. We can see that with the extends keyword. So hopefully that it's clear which is the superclass, which is the subclass. And I think I summarized this pretty well in terms of notes. So if you were to continue reading on, basically this PowerPoint or whatever would tell you this exact type of thing. But one important thing that it does mention that I haven't is that a class cannot extend more than one class. You just can't. It's just a rule in Java. You can extend exactly one class. You might have noticed, though, that there's this hierarchy here. So although grad student can only extend one class, it extended student, and therefore there's this sort of hierarchy because technically it also extends person. I'm not sure if I should use that terminology, but the inheritance that we're about to see will go all the way up the tree. So although grad student can only extend student, it will inherit everything from students' superclasses as well. So what is this inheritance we're talking about? So let's go into it. And we'll go into it in pretty strong detail. So let me know if there's any questions you have or confusion. So inheritance basically is what is a subclass getting from its superclass? And hopefully I'll also do a good job of explaining why you might do this as well. So it's pretty important to know that a subclass will inherit all of the methods and instance variables, or variables, I guess, of the superclass. I should say specifically instance variables. So if we go back to our person class, sorry. Okay, sure, here it is. Oh yeah, it was in the web browser. Person class has these instance variables, right? Name, SIN number, age, and it has these accessor methods, right? Get age, get SIN, it has these mutator methods. So when student extends person, it gets all those things. It gets a student class will also have private string my name and my SIN. It will also get private int my age. It also gets all these accessor methods too for accessing them, and all these mutator methods for changing them. It inherits all of those instance variables and methods when you extend, person. And let me just go back to the slideshow here. It's important to understand that private variables and private methods are inherited, but they are not directly accessible by the subclass. And that tracks with our definition of private. Remember private? Private means that, classes outside of this class cannot directly access them. So a subclass is outside of a superclass. They're not in the same class, right? They're outside of each other. So that means the rules for private hold up even for subclasses. Technically, there is a term, an access level. I'm not sure the exact term is. We know public and private. So technically, there are two other access levels. So they could allow for subclasses to have access, but anything outside of the hierarchy to not. But we don't need to know that for the AP exam, so I won't go into that too much more. The most important thing to know for the AP exam, anyways, is that you do inherit, you do get those private variables, and you get the private methods, but you just can't directly use them. So how do you use them? Well, you got to go through those accessor and mutator methods, which you also inherited. So you're in good shape. You're going to be able to use them. Just make sure that you do use them. That's where you might go wrong. You can have some trouble with that. Important to know that constructors are never inherited. That just does not happen. It's just a rule to be really clear about, and that's just the way it is. So don't assume that you can call constructors from from the superclass. Actually, there is a way to do it. It was the super keyword. We'll learn about that later. But just know that they're not inherited. So there's some special mechanism by which you could access them. So that's good to know. Now, by the way, it's also important to know that, we saw extending person, right? We saw student extends person, but we also know that something like undergrad extends student. So does it get just the student stuff, or does it get all the person stuff and the student stuff? That's right, the second one. It inherits everything that the subclass, no, sorry, let me try that again. A subclass inherits everything that a superclass has and everything that its superclass has inherited from its superclasses. So in other words, if I go back to our little diagram, a grad student is going to inherit all of the instance variables and methods of student and all of the instance variables and methods of person. Well, there you go. Isn't that nice? So it's going to inherit everything. So these ones at the bottom are inheriting a lot. Students inheriting some, and persons inheriting nothing. Well, technically it is from the object class, but we're not going to talk about that right now. But that's the ideal part of the story that we're going with. So that's great. So inheritance goes all the way up the tree. The grad student inherits from student and the person class. So there you go. It gets all those things. A couple other things to know is that a subclass can add additional instance variables and methods. So that's why it's called extends. You're treating the superclass as a foundation, but you are going to be adding additional things onto it. So just like in our code here, maybe I'll just go up to the diagram. A person needs to keep track of name and age and social insurance number for our purposes, but a student also has grades that they need to keep track of. So, a person isn't necessarily a student, so they might not actually need to keep track of any kind of grades. Maybe they're an employee, right? Like maybe they're a teacher or a janitor. They don't need a grades tabulation type of thing. They're not getting graded, but students do. So that's the reason why you might want to extend a person class or extend a student to have different types of students that have additional data that they store or additional methods, different operations they can do, different verbs, different actions they can take that extend just the plain old vanilla student. So that's great. Just gonna maybe show an example before we go too far. This is the bullet hell project from years gone by. I'll just open up quickly here. The bullet hell project was an example of an object-oriented project we did in earlier grades, but we didn't know quite as much about all this inheritance and all these hierarchies and stuff. We did extend a class, though, and I think it's a great example of how this works, so I thought I would just run it for you here. So here we are in our bullet hell game. I'll just quickly run it just for us to see it in action. Oh, I think I have an older version here. That sucks. Yeah, maybe I won't be running this. Really? Let me just try again. Is this really? GameObject.x does not exist. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I was showing it on a different computer the other day. But it seems like we have some problems here that, probably aren't that hard to solve, but I don't want to solve them on the fly on this video, so maybe I just won't worry about it. We did talk about it in class, so hopefully that is pretty clear. Maybe I'll just say what I would have said without the project. An example of what we've done in the past is we made something like a game object class that was at the top of this hierarchy. And then we made other classes like bullets and spaceships and enemies that all extended the game object class. And that was fantastic because we didn't have to program in each one of those entities in our game, like bullet or enemy, all the X and Y coordinates, the velocities, the colors, the lives, all those kind of things can be programmed once in the superclass. and then we extend them so that we can just focus on what's different and unique about each one of those classes. It saves us from having to program a lot. So for example, in the person class, maybe there's going to be all sorts of different types of people being tracked. You don't have to program a name field for your employee and your student and your grad student, your undergrad student. Name is just defined in person, and anything that extends person or extends something that extends person, ad infinitum, is going to have that string for name. You don't have to program it over and over again. Also, another advantage of this is for the person class, if you wanted to add something, like maybe you wanted to add a field for, what is their gender, a field for what's their favorite animal, I don't know, like whatever you want to do. If you add it to person, then it gets added to all these other classes too. The super class, if you make a change to it, it propagates down into all the other classes. So you don't have to go add it to student and undergrad and grad and employee. You can simply add it in the super class. So that saves a ton of time. It saves a ton of effort, and it makes things easier to improve. It makes things easier to debug. It just makes the whole act of making large-scale software manageable. And that's really what this is all about. Unfortunately, as an AP scholar, although we're diving deep into these interesting areas of Java, you're not going to make any large-scale software this year. It's just not going to happen. It probably won't happen in university till third year, fourth year, and even then maybe like co-op jobs before. So a lot of this is kind of theoretical at the moment. So hopefully you're able to kind of wrap your head around why that might be a useful thing, even though you're not getting to really make that big fancy software. But we can talk more about it. If you're not too sure why we're doing this or what its value is, please bring that question to class, and maybe we can work on some more examples. So that's basically inheritance. We could get into the nitty-gritty of declaring subclass objects, but I think I'm going to leave that for another video. I'm going to stop this video, and then we're going to upload this one, and then the next video we'll take a look at the actual coding of this and see what happens when you declare a particular variable and instantiate inside of it maybe a subclass of that variable's type. That's going to open up a whole bunch of interesting can of worms of things we can do. So stay tuned for that video. That's going to be our next one. Thanks, everybody.